The night was quiet, the way that the Australian bush gets quiet. Not peaceful, but heavy. Dean Harrison was moving through Springbrook Plateau in southeast Queensland when it happened. He had been investigating Yowie reports in the region for years. He knew the terrain, he knew the sounds, and he was also not easily rattled because he's Australian. Then, something moved ahead of him in the dark. It did not move in the way that maybe a kangaroo moves, or even a wallaby, or any of the dozens of animals that are probably trying to kill you in the Australian Outback. Harrison had spent years tracking through Queensland's hinterland. It moved with weight, deliberate, upright, and tall. Far too tall, actually, by his accounts. Harrison estimated it later was probably there at between about 7 and 8 feet. It turned around towards him, and for a moment, what he would later describe as two deep-set eyes caught the ambient light in the clearing. Dark, still, and fixed directly on him. And then it was gone. Not scrambling, not rushing through the undergrowth to get away from a human like a frightened animal would. It simply withdrew into the bush with a speed and silence that made no sense given its size. The vegetation barely moved. The forest resumed its silence like nothing had happened at all. Except something had happened. Harrison had dedicated years of his life to understanding what that something was. And he was not alone. Before him, there had been surveyors, farmers, Aboriginal elders, colonial journalists, and tens of thousands of Indigenous Australians stretching back 50 millennia, all describing the same thing. Something large, something upright, something that does not want to be found. This is the story of Australia's most enduring mystery. Not a creature born from colonial imagination or tourist mythology, something older, something that has been a part of the continent's story since humans first set foot on it. This is the story of the Yowie. To understand the Yowie, you have to start at the beginning, as with most things. Not the 1800s, not the first newspaper report, the actual beginning. Aboriginal Australians have occupied the continent for at least 65,000 years. That figure was confirmed in 2017 by a landmark study published in Nature, led by Chris Clarkson and his colleagues, which analyzed artifacts, which I know how to say this, and I'm not even going to say that I don't know how to say it. Anyways, they analyzed artifacts from the Majadbibi rock shelter in the Northern Territory. Sorry, it's just a word I've never seen before in my life. 65,000 years, as it is stated. That is longer than any other known continuous human culture on Earth. And woven through every strand of that extraordinary cultural record is a consistent and detailed, but also very deeply serious account of large hairy beings inhabiting the Australian wilderness. These are not just campfire stories. They were not the kind of comforting myths told to just children and be like, hey, stay out of the dark, and maybe it could explain what was rustling out there. This was concrete knowledge. This is something that was practical, it was empirical, and it was passed down by the Aboriginal Australians, encoded into the Dreamtime knowledge about animal behavior, seasonal food sources, dangerous terrain, flood patterns, and fire management. It's basically like, this is it. It's like basically not seeing alligators in Florida, which is where I am currently, and then being like, oh, these are alligators. Then everybody's like, alligators don't exist, except they do. Knowledge that has been repeatedly validated by modern science. The Gungungara people of the Blue Mountains in New South Wales called it Dulagagal, I believe, the hairy man of the mountains. Their accounts, recorded by researchers including Tony Healy and Paul Cropper in their 1994 landmark work Out of the Shadows, described a large bipedal terrestrial creature that inhabited the mountain ranges above the Nepean River, dangerous, unpredictable, very real, and will tear your arms off. The people there of the northern South Wales knew it as Dalagal, a creature of the deep brush and or deep bush, described with consistent physical characteristics: immense size, dark hair, a powerful odor, and a disposition towards aggression when cornered. Yeah, you typically don't want to corner an 8-foot tall anything. In Queensland, the Kuku Yalanji people left something actually fairly remarkable out there. In the lower region of Cape York Peninsula, at the rock art site known as Split Rock Gallery, there are figures painted into the stone that some researchers have interpreted as large elongated humanoid beings, which these are known as Quicken figures, carved and painted into the landscape over thousands of years. Percy Trezes, an Australian author and explorer who spent decades documenting the lower rock art, published detailed accounts of these figures in the rock art of southeast Cape York in 1971, and later publishing anyways, in Dream Road in 1993. Whether Quicken represents spirit beings, ancestors, or something observed in the physical world is a question that Aboriginal knowledge holders are best positioned to answer. But the figures are there, painted into the stone and very ancient. In Victoria, the Jabberwong, I believe, good lord, I can pronounce these things, but if you look it up, there's like 20 different ways to pronounce it, and I'm picking what is apparently the best one. But people described hairy men in the Highland Forest in oral records collected by early ethnographers. In the desert interior, various people spoke of the Jangara, a terrifying, hairy being of the deep country that you did not approach and did not provoke. Across dozens of distinct nations, separated by vast distances, and with no common cultural framework that could explain the convergence, the description held bipedal, hairy, large, dark, solitary, and dangerous when disturbed, associated with the mountain ranges, deep forests, and waterways of Australia. The anthropologist Robert Lawler, in Voices of the First Day in 1991, documented how Aboriginal knowledge systems consistently embedded ecological and environmental realities within their Dreamtime stories. When Aboriginal traditions describe a territorial, dangerous being in a specific landscape, they are not speaking metaphorically. They are cataloging the world as they observed it. These beings were not monsters under the bed. They were part of the landscape, part of the country, and the country had been observed, documented, and transmitted in extraordinary detail for 50,000 years. That is where the Yowie begins. Not a frightened colonial farmer, not a sensationalist newspaper headline with 50,000 years of accumulated human observation. That is where it begins. When the first fleet arrived in 1788, it brought with it something the continent had never encountered. People who had no framework for what the Australian bush actually contained. Britain was a managed landscape. Its forests were traversed, charted, and settled. Its wildlife had been cataloged. The idea that something large and unknown could exist in the wilderness was not, for British settlers, an intellectually comfortable concept. And yet, within decades of arrival, those settlers were encountering stories and then experiences that defied the categories entirely, which is pretty spooky. The first thing they reached for was a name. Jonathan Swift's novel Gulliver's Travels, published in 1726, had introduced the word Yahoo to the English-speaking world. In Swift's story, Yahoos were savage, ape-like humanoids, dirty, aggressive, ungovernable, your mom, and dark mirror of a rational human civilization. When the colonial Australians encountered Aboriginal accounts of a large, hairy, wild being in the bush, your mom, the word came just too easily. Too easily, perhaps, but it did stick. The Yahoo encountered colonial language. As documented by George Eberhardt in Mysterious Creatures in 2002, the term predated any formal scientific interest in the creature itself. It was the language of fear and incomprehension, the instinctive reach for an existing frame when the reality exceeded available vocabulary, which is pretty standard. I mean, try to explain the color green to somebody without being like, oh, just add blue and yellow together. Like, imagine if you were like super blind, right? Couldn't see anything. That's where language, if you ever want to know where language fails, that's the best example I think I have is like, yeah, just describe the color green. You can't. You're telling somebody who's blind, right, who can't see color, has never seen a color, can't point to a leaf, and you have to explain to them what the green looks like. It's impossible. Anyways, by the 1840s, accounts were circulating in the Braidwood district of New South Wales. A wild man in the woods. Documented in sources compiled by Healy and Cropper, it was being reported by farmers and pastoralists in the region. Not by Aboriginal informants, but by Europeans. People with no cultural incentive to mythologize the bush, and every practical incentive to explain what was happening to their livestock and property. In 1847, the Illustrated London News, one of the most widely read publications in the English-speaking world, referenced the Australian Yahoo. An international audience was now hearing about a creature from antipodes that defied classification. Rex Gilroy, A Mysterious Australia, 1995, identifies this one as one of the first international records of the creature in print. Through the 1860s and 1870s, the Blue Mountains and the Gippsland region of Victoria became focal points for Yahoo reports. Farmers described enormous footprints, bushmen described something watching them from the tree line, stockmen working in high country reported sounds at night that they could not attribute to any known animal, deep, resonant, and fairly close to where they were. The Australian bush was vast, ancient, and not a lot is known about the area, plus it's just completely hostile. But what lived in it was a question that settlers were only beginning to kind of seriously begin to think about. The answers were not always too comfortable either. On the 9th of October, 1876, Henry James McCooey sat down and wrote something that would echo through the Australian cryptid history for the next 150 years. And even right now, we're talking about it. The McCooey was near Bateman's Bay on or why did I say the McCooey? McCooey was near Bateman's Bay on the New South Wales coast when he encountered the creature. What he described in the Australian Town and Country Journal was not a blur in the dark, not a sound in the distance, not a Bigfoot, which we have here in North America, not a set of unexplained footprints. It was a direct, close-range observation. A creature approximately 5 feet tall, covered in chocolate brown hair, capable of moving on all fours but also upright. Large hands, large feet, and a quality of observation in the creature's behavior and awareness of McCooey's presence that he found deeply unsettling. McCooey threw stones at it, as one would do. The creature retreated into the bush. This was the first formally published first-person named eyewitness account of what would come to be called the Yowie. It appeared in a mainstream newspaper. It was written by a named individual. It established a physical description that would be mirrored by hundreds of witnesses over the next century and a half. 7 years later, in 1883, a cluster of reports emerged from Dora Creek area near the Lake Macquarie in New South Wales. Multiple unconnected witnesses, none of whom had any reason to coordinate their accounts, described a large hairy creature near the farms in the region. Unusual footprints were documented. Healy and Cropper, and Out of the Shadows, identified this as one of the earliest multi-witness events in the Yowie record. But then came Charles Harper with the chair. In 1912, I'm not sure why I pronounced it that way, Harper, a professional surveyor trained by occupation in precise field observation, documented an encounter in the Colonial Mountain region in New South Wales. His account, reproduced and analyzed by Healy and Cropper, is among the most detailed in historical record. He described a creature approximately 5.5 feet tall, covered in long black hair with a broad, flat face, a pronounced jaw, a wide mouth, and no visible neck. The head appeared to sit directly on the shoulders. The shoulders themselves were massive. Harper had encountered it at close range. Before it retreated, the creature produced a series of deep guttural vocalizations. Not random sounds, but sounds with structure. Sounds that communicated something. Maybe it was trying to talk and say, "Get off my land." I don't know. Harper was not a superstitious man. He was not prone to embellishment and, kind of his reputation is on the line as a surveyor. He measured and recorded what he saw. That's what he was paid for. And what he saw, he committed to paper with the same precision he applied to his professional work. So, a pattern emerges that is difficult to explain away. McCooey in 1876, Dora Creek Farmers in 1883, Harper in 1912. Different regions, different decades, no social media, no national Yowie mythology to draw from. The creature had barely entered the public consciousness, and yet the core description is identical. Bipedal, large, dark-haired, powerfully built, evasive, capable of rapid disappearance in the dark bush. If it was a fabrication or misidentification, the coincidences of detail across unconnected witnesses separated by geography and time, that kind of demands an explanation on its own, and I don't think we're going to get one, probably because the Yowie's out there actually being real. In every credible sighting report, in historical and modern record, what emerges is disturbingly consistent. The Yowie stands between 6 to 10 feet tall. Most reports cluster around 7 to 8 feet. Extreme accounts, a small minority, and treated accordingly, push that figure towards 12 feet. Now, how big is Bigfoot supposed to be? I don't think he's like 12 feet tall, but he's pretty big. But the point is that, people can kind of mess that up, mainly when they're afraid. But this build is not simply large, it is disproportionate in a specific way. Shoulders that are abnormally broad, arms that hang lower than they should relative to body, and a torso that is barrel-shaped and heavily muscled. These proportions were not human. They are reminiscent of a great ape, specifically a gorilla, which shares the barrel chest, the minimal neck, and the arm-to-body ratio described consistently in Yowie accounts. The face is not simply large, it is architecturally different from a human face. A pronounced brow ridge sits heavily over deep-set eyes. The face is flat and broad, and the jaw protrudes, what anatomists call prognathism, and a conformation associated with the archaic hominin species rather than modern humans. The mouth is wide, the lips are thin. In nighttime encounters, the eyes consistently reflect light in a reddish or yellowish tone, as a phenomenon is actually known in nocturnal animals by the tapetum lucidum, a reflective layer behind the retina that amplifies available light. Basically, look into your cat's eyes or dog's eyes at night or shine a flashlight or something. That light that reflects back is the tapetum lucidum. But the hair is long and dark, brown to black in most accounts, with some reports of reddish colorization. Gray or lighter in tones appear in accounts involving what witnesses describe as older individuals, a color shift with age that mirrors the silverback change in gorillas. Then there is the odor. Multiple witnesses from the colonial era farmers to modern bushwalkers describe the same thing. A powerful, pervasive smell. Not the smell of wet dog or unwashed human, something more complex and more aggressive than that. rotting vegetation combined with a deep animal musk. Some accounts add a sulfuric quality. The consistency of this olfactory description across independent witnesses is remarkable, and it has a biological parallel. Large primates and many large mammals use scent as a territory marking mechanism, and the odor is not incidental, it may be functional. The feet also tell their own story. Starting with the feet, footprints ranging from 16 to 24 inches in length have been documented across multiple decades and regions. Rex Gilroy, who was at the Blue Mountains collection, represents the largest body of Yowie footprint evidence in Australia. Documented cast sequences showing a stride length of 5 to 7 feet. The ground coverage of a very large bipedal animal moving at a walking pace. Some casts show a possible divergent hallux, a splayed big toe, which is a defining anatomical feature of non-human primates. In humans, the big toe is aligned with the others. In great apes, its functions are going to be more like a thumb angled away from the foot itself. If these casts are genuine, that single anatomical detail is enormously significant. Researchers, including Jeff Meldrum, Associate Professor of Anatomy at Idaho State University and one of the few credentialed scientists to formally analyze wild man footprint evidence, have used primate foot morphology as a framework for assessing such casts. His work, published in Sasquatch Legend Meets Science in 2006, provides analytical tools applicable directly to Yowie evidence. Locomotion appears to be primarily bipedal, but several accounts describe a shift to quadrupedal movement at speed. Knuckle walking, or a bouncing gait, consistent with a behavioral flexibility seen in known great apes, which are capable of both modes of movement. Two broad physical types have emerged from the weight of sighting data. Type 1 is the larger, more aggressive profile, 12 to 7 or 7 to 12 feet, I guess. Dark-haired, encountered primarily in Queensland and high-altitude NSW regions. Type 2 is smaller, 5 to 6 feet, more human proportion, less immediately threatening in demeanor, and appears more frequently in lower altitude accounts. Whether these represent age differences, sexual dimorphism, geographical subspeciation, or entirely separate phenomenon still remains unknown. Now here's where the Yowie becomes genuinely extraordinary and genuinely difficult. Australia has no primate fossil record. None. The continent separated from Gondwana supercontinent approximately 45 to 50 million years ago, which was before primates emerged as a distinct mammalian order. The evolutionary divergence that produced monkeys, apes, and eventually hominids happened in Africa and Asia, after Australia had already become its own biological island. John Long and colleagues in Prehistoric Mammals in Australia and New Guinea in 2002 made this explicit. The fossil record of Australia is not sparse or poorly studied. It is well documented, and it contains no primates. This is not a gap in science, this is the science. For any large primate to exist in Australia, it would have needed to arrive, and the question of how it arrived is where these theories start to fracture. Most frequently proposed candidate of cryptozoological literature is Gigantopithecus blacki, a massive ape known from fossil teeth and jawbones found in southern China and Vietnam. Gigantopithecus was real, and its existence is not in question. Estimates based on its dental and jaw dimensions place it at 8 to 10 feet tall and up to 500 kilograms, which is pretty heavy, which in the Lord's units is 1,102 pounds, the largest ape that ever lived. It is believed to have survived until approximately about 100,000 years ago. Basically, the climate began to change and it got kind of outcompeted by smaller hominids. It's kind of thought that maybe orangutan is somewhat related, but the proposal is that during the last glacial maximum, roughly 220,000 years ago, sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today. Land bridges that reduced water crossings connected Southeast Asia and with now Indonesian archipelago. Could a population of Gigantopithecus or a related species have island hopped eastward and eventually reached Australia? Roland Chauchan and John Olson, as well as Jamie James, that's a classic name, investigated the Gigantopithecus question extensively in their Other Origins, the search for giant ape in human prehistory back in 1990. Their conclusion measured Gigantopithecus was a genuine and remarkable animal, but its known range was limited to southern China and mainland Southeast Asia. Now, the thing about this is we find animals sometimes all the time in areas they're not supposed to be because they just sometimes want to do it. I mean, look at that one penguin that was a meme for like 12 minutes about how it went off into the mountains and died because it wanted to leave society or whatever people were claiming. Yeah, it was sick, so it left. That's basically what it comes down to. But anyways, animals do this all the time, and it could have been a possibility then. But a 2017 review by Zhang and Harrison in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology confirmed that no Gigantopithecus fossil has ever been found in Australia, New Guinea, or anywhere along the proposed migration route. The hypothesis is not impossible, it's just simply unsupported by physical evidence. The megafauna alternative is also worth examining. Australia was home to extraordinarily large animals until approximately 46,000 years ago. A timeline confirmed by Richard Roberts and colleagues in a 2001 paper in Science. Among them was a Procoptodon galea, a giant short-faced kangaroo that stood 2 meters tall, which is about 6.5 feet tall, and weighed 230 kilograms, which, as we all know in the Lord's units, is going to be about, I don't know, what is that? 507 pounds. Quick maths. There was Diprotodon optatum, a rhinoceros-sized wombat relative. There was Thylaccoleo carnifex, a marsupial lion with a retractable claw and a bite force exceeding a spotted hyena. Australia's ancient fauna is extraordinary, but marsupial physiology does not naturally support sustained bipedalism at large body masses. The mechanics just do not align with what witnesses consistently describe. The scientifically adventurous hypothesis, and the one that current evidence, thin as it is, least obviously contradicts, is an undiscovered primate lineage that reached Australia during the Pleistocene sea level fluctuations via island hopping migration. Say that 5 times fast. Holy Lord. The precedent for this kind of scenario exists in the fossil record. Homo florensis, discovered on the Indonesian island of Flores and first described by Peter Brown and colleagues in the landmark 2004 paper in Nature, was a 3.5 foot tall, that makes sense, hominin that made stone tools and survived until approximately 50,000 years ago. It reached Flores via open water crossings that existed on a remote island for hundreds of thousands of years without being known to science. Its existence was considered impossible by many researchers until the bones were found. The lesson of Homo florensis, or florensius, there we go, florensiensis, Floresiensis, there we go, is not that the Yowie is real. The lesson is that the isolated populations of hominids can survive in remote environments for extraordinary lengths of time without entering the scientific record until they do. The Yowie, if it exists, is extraordinarily good at not being found. Its apparent range covers some of the most demanding terrain in eastern Australia. The Blue Mountains of New South Wales, a sandstone plateau cut by deep gorges and carpeted in temperature eucalypt and rainforest, extend over 1 million hectares and contain vast tracts of land that see almost no human foot traffic. The Springbrook Plateau and Lamington National Park in southeast Queensland offered subtropical and temperate rainforests so dense that aerial survey cannot penetrate the canopy. The Brindabella Ranges, straddling New South Wales and the Australian Capital Territory, rise to nearly 1,900 meters and remain snow-covered through winter. These are not convenient, well-mapped landscapes. They are an ancient, rugged, and in many sections, genuinely just remote area. Every major Yowie sighting hotspot shares this same profile: rugged elevation, dense canopy, low human density, reliable water sources, and abundant food resources. The behavioral picture built from the accumulated reports kind of suggests a large omnivore. No direct Yowie feeding behavior has ever been confirmed, but ecological inference from body size and habitat points to a dietary profile similar to a large-bodied primate adapted to temperate forests: fruits, tubers, roots, insects, bird eggs, and small game. Reports of disturbed beehives, damaged fruit trees, and interfered with livestock enclosures consistently cluster near sighting events. The behavioral signature of an opportunistic, intelligent forager. Activity is predominantly nocturnal or crepuscular. Most credible sightings occur at dawn or dusk, or during the night. This is consistent with the broader pattern of large Australian mammals avoiding active human periods. It is adaptive, not mysterious. Social structures, based on accumulated report data, appears to be largely solitary. Group sightings are extremely rare. Low population density is expected for any large mammal operating near the top of its ecological niche, and consistent with what is known about great ape distribution. Male gorillas maintain large exclusive territories. Orangutans are the most solitary of the great apes. Both show behavioral patterns, scent marking, deliberate threat displays, strategic retreat that mirror what is described in Yowie Encounters. The creature's primary strategy appears to just be avoidance. In the majority of encounters, the Yowie detects the human observer before being seen and then withdraws. This requires advanced sensory capability, most likely olfactory, given the documented sensitivity of known great apes to human scent at significant distances. The sheer number of reports in which witnesses describe a sudden sense of being watched, followed by movement and then silence, is consistent with an animal whose primary defensive mechanism is detection and evasion rather than confrontation, because they don't want to confront humanity. It's because we're the best. The modern era of Yowie research began in the Blue Mountains. Rex Gilroy was a naturalist working out of Katoomba in the 1970s when he began systematically collecting what would eventually become the largest single archive of Yowie evidence in Australia. Over 4 decades, Gilroy documented more than 3,000 reported encounters. He collected footprint casts, he interviewed witnesses, he published 2 major works, Mysterious Australia in 1995 and Giants from the Dreamtime in 2001, the most comprehensive books dedicated exclusively to the subject. Gilroy was and remains a controversial figure, though. His broader theories extend well beyond standard cryptozoology into the territory that most researchers, even sympathetic ones, find a bit difficult to follow. Some of the footprint casts have been questioned for their authenticity, and his work has never really entered peer-reviewed science. But his archive, the raw data, and the witness statements, as well as the geographical distribution of these reports, remains a primary resource for anyone seriously investigating the subject. The work itself, whatever its theoretical scaffolding is basically the record. In 1994, Dean Harrison established Australian Yowie Research, which became the most professionally structured Yowie investigation organization in the country. Harrison's approach differed from Gilroy's in emphasis. Rigorous documentation, GPS coordinates for sighting locations, vegetation typing, a photographic record, and a publicly accessible database that now contains hundreds of reports spanning more than 2 decades. And the thing is, Harrison has had multiple personal encounters. He has published his methodology and his findings. He has pursued the subject with a kind of systematic discipline that distinguishes the investigation from just advocacy, I guess you could call it. But how do you advocate for something that may not exist? I'm not really sure. Well, wait a minute. Maybe I am. I don't really know. It just depends. The institutional response from Australian science has just been silence. No university department of zoology, biology, or anthropology has funded formal Yowie investigations because typically they don't want to do anything fun. The topic carries the same academic stigma that Brian Regal, in Searching for Sasquatch in 2011, documents as a global phenomenon. The fear of professional contamination by association with a subject perceived as pseudoscience, regardless of the underlying evidential record. Now, if you think that's stupid, or not stupid to not engage in it, just remember, most science is a lot of politics. Science, like I've worked with scientists, they're some of the most political losers I've ever met in my life. And also, along with that, what is it, Galileo with the heliocentric model versus geocentric model? They laughed him out of the room because they're like, of course, the Earth is the center of the solar system, and nay, the galaxy, nay, the universe. We now know that to be completely untrue. We orbit the sun. Kind of a similar thing here. Typically, it's kind of ironic because everybody always looks at scientists and stuff. And they're like, oh, those are going to be the ones that want to figure it out. Yeah, at the beginning. But then as they get established, really, they're just more worried about their reputation. So always remember that. Anyways, DNA testing has been attempted on what has been found. Hair samples and possible scat samples collected in the field have been submitted for analysis over the years. The results have consistently identified known Australian fauna, wombats, possums, macropods, and returned degraded, unidentified material as well. No confirmed biological sample of an unknown primate has ever been produced. Brian Sykes and colleagues in a landmark 2014 study published in Proceedings of Royal Society B applied rigorous genetic analysis to hair samples attributed to cryptid primates globally. His methodology, applied to Yowie samples, would represent the most scientifically credible test that the subject has ever received. The test has not been formally conducted. The evidentiary record for the Yowie falls into 4 categories. Footprints are the most physically substantiated. Gilroy's Blue Mountains collection contains casts with dimensions incompatible with known Australian fauna and stride sequences that have been measured and documented. The possible divergent hallux in some casts represent a specific anatomical detail that would require knowledge of non-human primate anatomy to deliberately fabricate, knowledge that most hoaxers simply do not possess. None of this confirms the Yowie's existence, by the way. They could totally figure this out, but but it establishes a physical record that cannot be entirely explained by misidentification or simple fabrication. Audio is the most atmospheric. Field recordings made during AYR investigations in Yowie active areas have captured vocalizations that researchers have not been able to attribute to a known species. Deep, rhythmic howling, guttural, non-repetitive barking, high-pitched distress calls that carry through dense forest, but no formal bioacoustic analysis matches any recordings to a known species ever. Environmental disturbances is kind of the most circumstantial, though. Broken branches at heights of 7 to 10 feet tall, inconsistent with known wildlife in those ecosystems, structures of stacked or leaning branches in remote areas, livestock disturbances in areas where known predators leave no tracks. Each of these individually means very little, but taken as a pattern across consistent geographical hotspots over decades, they become harder to dismiss. Witness testimony is obviously the most durable, as you might imagine. Healy and Cropper's witness analysis in Out of the Shadows documents a cross-demographic record that includes farmers, police officers, national park rangers, licensed hunters, military personnel, and experienced bushwalkers. This consistency of physical descriptions across unrelated witnesses, separated by decades and geography, that is not as easily explained by cultural contamination or shared mythology. Many of the most credible reports come from witnesses who had no prior knowledge of the Yowie and actively sought rational explanations before reporting what they had seen. The Yowie does not stand alone. Every inhabited region of Earth with significant wilderness area has produced its own wild man tradition. North America, as you know, has Bigfoot, known to First Nations peoples across the Pacific Northwest for millennia, way before European contact. The Himalayas have the Yeti, described in Sherpa and Tibetan Buddhist tradition as a creature of the high passes. Sumatra has the orange pendek, a smaller, perhaps 3 to 5 feet tall. It's kind of documented through footprints and hair samples in the Kerinci forest. Central Asia has the almas. Central China has a Yurin, which is the subject of a state-funded expedition in 1977. The Chinese took it serious enough to actually do an expedition. New Zealand has the mohau, described in Maori traditions as the morero. The Sykes 2014 study in Proceedings of the Royal Society B subjected hair samples from multiple wildman traditions to rigorous DNA analysis. The Himalayan Yeti samples returned primarily bear, most likely the Tibetan brown bear, suggesting that at least some of the Yeti reports involved misidentification of known large mammals. The same principle applies to the Yowie. Some percentage of reports almost certainly involve misidentification of large kangaroos, escaped animals, or human beings observed under unusual conditions. But Sykes' study also identified the fundamental limitation of the wildman research field. The absence of confirmed biological material leaves every hypothesis open. You cannot, unfortunately, run DNA analysis on a creature that has left no confirmed biological trace. Among all wildman traditions globally, the Yowie occupies a fairly unique and paradoxical position. It has the oldest unbroken cultural record, 50,000 plus years of Aboriginal documentation, and yet it exists on a continent with the most problematic biology for its existence. No fossil precedent, no primate record, no confirmed sample, and yet the witnesses' records stretching uninterrupted from the deep past to the present day just refuse to stop accumulating. The single most powerful argument against the Yowie's biological existence, is the fossil record itself. Australia's paleontological record is not poorly studied or just incomplete. It is detailed, extensively researched, and categorically absent of any primate, ape, or large bipedal non-marsupial mammal. John Long and colleagues documented this comprehensively in Prehistoric Mammals of Australia and New Guinea in 2002. For a large primate to have existed on this continent for any significant period without leaving bones, teeth, confirmed genetic material in the record, hair, a picture at this point, from a strictly scientific standpoint would be extraordinary. The misidentification problem could possibly be real. Large male eastern gray kangaroos can stand over 6 feet tall in low light at distance. A large kangaroo standing upright with his forepaws raised is not entirely unlike a large bipedal primate. Feral humans, Aboriginal people living in traditional isolation in colonial Australia, may have also been perceived by settlers through a distorted lens. These explanations account for some reports, but they do not account for all of them. The hoax problem is also very real. Fabricated footprints, carved from wood, created with prosthetic forms, have been confirmed in the Yowie record, as in every wildman research tradition globally. Somebody likes screwing with everybody. Some photographic evidence circulated as Yowie documentation has been identified as costumes or prosthetic fabrication. This damages the field's credibility in ways that cannot be easily repaired, unless we see one of these things and actually be like, yeah, they exist. So that's going to take probably video and photo evidence and probably even capturing one. Michael Shermer, in Why People Believe Weird Things in 2002, provides the methodology critique that applies most directly. Researchers who actively seek Yowie evidence are predisposed to interpret ambiguous signals, sounds, tracks, disturbances as Yowie related. Without rigorous control methodology, field investigations cannot establish what non-Yowie activity even looks like in the same environment. The absence of that baseline undermines almost all field research conducted to date. And yet, Australia continues to yield newly discovered species every single year. The ocean rock rat, Blaustes enigmatus, was confirmed as a living mammal species in 2005, a member of a rodent lineage previously believed to be extinct for 11 million years. The coelacanth was considered extinct for 65 million years until a living specimen was caught off the South African coast in 1938. The okpi, a large forest ungulate closely related to a giraffe, was unknown to the Western science until 1901, despite generations of local knowledge about its existence. The argument from absence, we haven't found it, therefore it doesn't exist, is really not the same as the argument from evidence. They are different epistemological positions, and conflating them is not science. It is just pretty much an assumption. Basically, what that statement means is just because you have the stance it doesn't exist because we haven't seen it is not the same strength as just because we haven't found evidence doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Anyways, the Yowie did not stay in the bush. It found its way into culture. But for British settlers, the Yowie represented the deepest anxiety of colonial experiences. An ancient wilderness, vast and unknowable, that harbored something the settlers did not understand and could not govern. The creature embodied what the bush itself represented, the refusal to be civilized, mapped, or controlled. As David Trigger and Cameo Daly analyzed in Reviews in Anthropology 2010, the negotiation of wilderness identity in colonial Australia was always also a negotiation of power. For Aboriginal communities, the picture is different and a bit more complex. The Yowie, in its many indigenous forms, represents something that Aboriginal people documented and encoded into cultural memory long before the first European ship crossed into the horizon. Its persistence is a statement about the depth and accuracy of indigenous ecological knowledge. It is also, for many communities, a reminder that the land holds things that Western science has not yet confirmed, cataloged, or explained. And then came the chocolate. In 1997, Cadbury Australia launched the Yowie confectionery line, chocolate eggs containing collectible figures of Australian wildlife. The product became one of the most successful children's food brands in the country's history. The Yowie Group Ltd. eventually relaunched the brand independently and expanded it internationally. A creature that had been described for 50,000 years as dangerous, territorial, and terrifying became a child-friendly symbol of Australian nature, a feat of commercial rebranding that would impress any marketing department. The juxtaposition is instructive. Within a single generation, the Yowie moved from the subject of frightened witness reports and serious folkloric tradition to a collectible toy inside a supermarket egg. The commercializing of anything really says nothing about whether the creature is real, but it says something about how quickly a culture can absorb even its most unsettling mysteries into the mainstream. So obviously there's plenty of theories about this thing, but the most dramatic theory, a surviving population of Gigantopithecus blacki, a large known ape, it used to be in Earth's history, migrated in Australia via the Sahul landmass and the island chains during periods of lower sea levels, and it has persisted in isolated pockets of eastern Australian forests. The physical description, massive in size, upright, movement, dark hair, it all aligns superficially with what is known about Gigantopithecus anatomy. But the problem is that no Gigantopithecus fossil has ever been found outside of southern China and mainland Southeast Asia. Zhang and Harrison's 2017 review confirms this definitively. The proposed migration routes require open water crossings that no known great ape has been documented making. The hypothesis is imaginative, physically consistent with descriptions, and currently without a single piece of supporting physical evidence, so that's probably out. The next one is Australia's megafauna, extinct as of approximately 46,000 years ago, including animals of remarkable size and diversity. A large bipedal marsupial, unknown to science, might explain the Yowie reports through a lens of convergence evolution. A marsupial that independently developed an upright posture, forward-facing senses, and a large body size within Australia's isolated evolutionary environment. But marsupial physiology does not support sustained bipedalism at high body mass. landmass. The joint structure, musculature, and metabolic demands of large marsupials are not compatible with the consistently bipedal locomotion described in Yowie accounts. Roberts in 2001 also confirms that Australia's megafaunal extinctions were continent-wide and geologically recent. A surviving megafaunal species of this size would require a survival explanation even more demanding than its initial existence. The third theory is maybe a population of the Pleistocene-era hominin, potentially a branch of Homo or a closely related genus, reaching Australia via island hopping during the glacial sea level lows and establish a persistent, isolated population in eastern Australian forests. The precedent of Homo floresiensis demonstrates that small hominin populations can reach remote islands via open water and survive undetected in the fossil record for substantial periods. But the problem is that Homo floresiensis was found on a small island with a clear biogeographic corridor. Australia's crossing would have required longer open water transits. No hominid fossil of any kind has been found in Australia outside of the Homo sapiens record. But this theory is the least obviously contradicted by available evidence, and it has the structural advantage of explanatory parsimony. It requires fewer violations of known biology than the Gigantopithecus hypothesis. The fourth one, the most parsimonious explanation, is that the Yowie does not really represent a single biological entity, but a cultural pattern sustained by misidentification, folklore transmission, and a psychological need to populate vast, dark wildernesses with appropriate threat. Large kangaroos, feral animals, human figures seen at a distance, isolated instances of genuine fear and unfamiliar terrain translated over time into a consistent narrative. This explanation handles individual sightings reasonably well. It handles the colonial and modern record adequately. It handles one of the Aboriginal records, which is pre-contact, internally consistent across dozens of unconnected nations, and embedded in the same empirical knowledge framework that have proven accurate about every other aspect of Australian ecology. Cultural transmission does not explain the convergence. The fifth one, the most scientifically open-ended theory, is that a primate lineage unknown to science, distinct from any previously described species, reached Australia during the Pleistocene and maintained a low-density, highly elusive population in the remote forests of eastern Australia. Not Gigantopithecus, not a known hominid, something else. Something that occupied a niche that left no confirmed trace in the fossil record and has proven extraordinarily resistant to physical detection. Without a specimen, though, a confirmed DNA sample or a fossil, this theory is unfalsified in its current form. Science does not require certainty before investigating, but it requires evidence before concluding. So what could it be? Well, the most logically defensible position, based on the available evidence and the frameworks provided by paleoanthropology, behavioral ecology, and the history of biological discovery, is that the Yowie reports reflect repeated human encounters with an undescribed large primate or hominid that entered Australia during the Pleistocene sea level fluctuations, most likely during the period 60,000 to 100,000 years ago, when island chains between Southeast Asia and the Sahul landmass were shorter and more crossable than they are today. This population established itself in the forested areas of the eastern ranges, where rugged terrain, low human density, and an abundance of resources provided the conditions for a small, isolated group to persist across the millennia. Its low population density, advanced evasion behavior, and primarily nocturnal activity patterns kind of explain the absence of a confirmed physical specimen. The consistency of the physical descriptions across the Aboriginal oral tradition and 2 centuries of independent European observation, all those descriptions could not have just been culturally borrowed across the full chronological span, and this suggests repeated encounters with the same type of organism rather than just a shared mythology. Now, this is not a comfortable conclusion. It sits uneasily against the fossil record. It demands geological and biological circumstances that have been confirmed. It requires an organism to have existed in Australia for potentially 60,000 years without entering the scientific record. But consider what we know. We know Homo floresiensis existed for hundreds of thousands of years on a remote Indonesian island without being known to science. We know that the Laotian rock rat survived 11 million years beyond its supposed extinction date. We know Aboriginal Australians documented something in the Australian wilderness for 50,000 years using the same empirical observation framework that correctly documented the rest of the ecology, geology, and fauna of a continent in extraordinary detail. We know hundreds of independent witnesses across 2 centuries have provided physical, consistent descriptions of the same anomalous entity without access to a common cultural template, and we know that the forest ranges of eastern Australia contain millions of hectares that are, they're just not surveyed, to be honest with you. The absence of a confirmed specimen is the strongest argument against the Yowie's existence, but the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, particularly in a landscape as vast, ancient, and poorly explored explored as the Australian bush. The honest answer to what the Yowie is, based on everything the evidence can tell us, is this. Now that you've watched this for, 40-something minutes, we don't know. Not because the question is unanswerable, but because it has never been seriously asked by the scientific institutions with the tools to answer it. 50,000 years of Aboriginal observation built a knowledge system that provided us accurate information about everything else in Australia's environment. The question worth asking is not whether we believe in the Yowie. Does it believe in us? No. The question is whether we are intellectually honest enough to take seriously what the oldest continuous culture on Earth has been telling us since before recorded history began. Something is in that bush. Phrasing. Whether it still is, that is a different question, and the only way to find out is if we actually go looking. Now, as always, I like to jump in here. I think this entire video is pretty much succinctly going to discuss the possibilities of what could be out there, and personally, I don't think it's Gigantopithecus. I don't think people are just straight up lying. I think they are seeing something. The problem is usually, as it always is misidentification of a species. So if you have kangaroos standing upright, yeah, there's some big kangaroo out there. But here's the question. Let's take, in particular, the Aboriginals. If they're the ones that have been seeing this, after 50,000 years, you would think the whole kangaroo question would probably be like, yeah, it's a kangaroo, don't worry about it. So to me, it's like, could there have been another hominid species actually on the islands and we just didn't know about it? It's completely possible. And could there have been something that split off from Gigantopithecus that was just a larger... You didn't even remember, Homo sapiens typically on average is shorter than Homo erectus, which, according to the theory of evolution, we came from. So is it possible that something split off of Gigantopithecus that may have been smaller, but, it still was different? And if you're like, well, how could Gigantopithecus exist and then whatever average Pithecus? How could average Pithecus exist and Gigantopithecus? Well, Neanderthalensis and Sapiens existed at the same time too. So it's just kind of like, as that split happens, why is it happening? And also, you got to remember, animals get larger on isolated islands. So if there was a species of Gigantopithecus that did migrate and get to some islands, and it was able to survive there for a little while, going from islands to a continent like Australia, typically animals actually get smaller. So at least from, if I'm remembering, I forget whose law it is, but it doesn't matter. It kind of matters. But the point is that it probably could just be an unidentified ape that we haven't really seen yet. And if it does exist, then I say we go find it. Roanoke Tales going international to go find the Yowie. Anyways, I'm going to leave that there. Thank you guys for watching. If you did enjoy, then please leave a like. It helps get the video out there. And subscribing is a great way to stay up to date on what I post. I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Instagram, Patreon, Roanoke Gaming links in the description. And speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. At the Literal Wendigo tier, we have Gradius, Monkey Man, Scrungle, and Invictus Echo, as well as Drake Von Lord. Thank you guys for your awesome support. At the Eyewitness event tier, we have Beaver Malaga, Dragon Master Knight, and Hope Blighton. Thank you guys as well. The first-hand accounts here, we have Citity and Need Extra Lives. And the second-hand accounts here, we have Troy, Pouches, Hendrick. And that's where that's going to end there, even though I didn't say, it didn't sound like it was going to end with Hendrick, but it did. Anyways, and to the rest of my patrons, I really do appreciate y'all's support as well. It goes a long way towards helping out. So thank you. But all right, that's going to do it for me. Hope everyone enjoyed, and we'll see y'all in the next one.